Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see everybody here. And I'm going to mute everybody just in order to black out background sounds. But you're welcome to come in and contribute to the shir whenever you like. The first few minutes, I'm going to be a little bit occupied admitting people. You might notice Eli Friedwald's not here this morning, so I'm doing the administration as well. Firstly, I'd like to thank Hadassah Fuchs. Good morning, Hadassah. Thank you for your sponsorship this morning, much appreciated. And we're recording this. Shir, so everybody be aware of the recording, and we can make a start. Now, of course, today is Asara B'Tevis, so I thought I'd start with learning a little bit about Asara B'Tevis, just because we want to participate, whether you're fasting or if for health reasons you're not fasting. One should not be perish minat tzibur. One should participate with what Klal Yisrael are doing. And today, Klal Yisrael are involved in the fast of Asara B'Tevis. So Asara B'Tevis is one of the 4 fasts which are connected to the Churban Habayis, as we'll see in a moment. I think what I'll do is have a look with you at a few psukim from the very end of Malachim Beis. Just to remind you, in the Tanakh itself, we have Yeshua, Shoftim, Malachim Aleph, Malachim Beis, which are the narrative of the biblical period, if you like. That's the narrative, and the narrative ends in disaster. Right, Malachim Beis, chapter 25, that we're going to be looking at in a moment, is the description of the Churban Bayis Rishon, about the destruction of Yerushalayim, the burning of the Beis Hamikdash, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonian invasion, and all the events connected to what we call the Churban, the original Churban Habayis. Excuse me, I'm just admitting people from the waiting room. All this is in the very, very end of Malachim Beis. But of course, so in a sense, the narrative ends on a sad note. But the truth is, the narrative is then, we know that generally speaking, we don't want to end any biblical or Jewish narrative on a sad note. We always try and end on an optimistic note. But for that, you have to look in 2 other sources. One source is what is called the Nevi'im, the writings of the Nevi'im, particularly the last 3 Nevi'im, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, who are participating in the Shivas Tzia. They are participating in the return to Yerushalayim and the rebuilding of the Bayis Sheni. So really what we've got is the narrative in Malachim Beis ends in disaster, but the narrative actually continues elsewhere in the Tanakh. You have to know how to join the dots a little bit in the Tanakh. And so we'll be looking at something from Malachim Beis, which is in a sense the bad news. And then we'll have a look at something from Zechariah, who prophesizes, who witnesses already the rebuilding of the Bayis Sheni, but more than that, he prophesizes the ultimate Geula. He prophesizes the return of the whole of Klal Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael. Don't forget that in the Bayis Sheni, only a small part of the Jewish people came back to the land of Israel. But Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi have got nevuos, have got prophecies of much greater geula than that. So really, on Asara B'Tevis, the thing to do is, what one should do on every tinus of this sort is look at both sides of the coin. After we've looked at Asara B'Tevis, we'll get back to Avraham Avinu and maybe some related material in Parshas Lech Lecha, which I'll show you. But let's first have a look at some text in Malachim Bey's the sad account of the destruction. Incidentally, those of you who ever go, and I'd highly recommend this, to go on a guided tour of Ir David. Have you ever been in the city of David? Anyone been to the city of David just outside the walls of Yerushalayim? There is Ir David, and a most amazing archaeological dig. And they've actually found, when they dig through archaeological levels, they have found one very, very thick archaeological layer of ash and burnt wood, which dates back to 2,600 years ago, the time of the Churban Bayis Rishon. We have archaeological remnants and archaeological indications of what we're going to read in Malachim Beis. And you can see, actually, once they dig past that layer, they found all sorts of coins and seals and utensils which are from the Bayis Rishon, from the first temple period. That's Ir David, just outside the current walls of Yerushalayim. The exact history of the walls of Yerushalayim is also a very interesting subject, but not for now. But certainly, the story of Asara B'Teves relates very directly to the whole issue of the Chomot Yerushalayim. And we are all, Baruch Hashem, we've had the zechus in our generation to return to Eretz Yisrael, and some of us have returned not only to Eretz Yisrael, but to return to Yerushalayim itself. And to see the walls of Yerushalayim, and to see today the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects us, right? Al Chomosayich Yerushalayim, Hifkadati Shomrim, Kol Hayom Kol Halayla, the Shomrim, the guards of Yerushalayim, which are both the Chayalim, of course, in the physical world of the Chayalim, and in the spiritual world, there are special Malachim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who can doubt that there are special Malachim protecting us from the hundreds of millions of enemies that surround us? Clearly, we are living tachas kanfei hashchina, but we are Asara B'Teves. We remember the disasters along the way. So let's have a look at a little bit of text here for a second. Let's see if I can get it up on the screen. No, bear with me for 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. Bear with me. I'm doing quite a bit of work on my second. Titled Asara B'Teves. Okay, second, back to the screen. Right, let's try this again. Share screen. Asara B'Teves. That's it. Okay, can you see a screen? Yes? Yes, thank you. Good. So this is Asara B'Teves, as I've written here at the top, the Babylonian siege of Yerushalayim, the beginning of the Churban, right? 588 BCE. The actual dating is something of a discussion between Chazal and modern historians, but I'm not going to go into that for the moment. There is a discrepancy. There's a discrepancy of about 160 years between the two, exactly when these things happen, but we're going to stick with this date, 588 BCE, which I think is the generally accepted date of when these events took place. So we're talking about really 2,600 years ago. The destruction of Yerushalayim. Until that point, the Beis Hamikdash had stood in all its glory, right? But at that point, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire came and destroyed it completely. And here you have in the first pasuk a reference to Asara B'Teves. You can see this, ladies and gentlemen. And right, this is the highlighted text here. For some reason. Right, Vahi b'shnas ha'tshiyis l'mocha, the 9th year of Tzidkiyahu's reign. So Tzidkiyahu was a type of a puppet king that had been appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to keep the peace and law and order in Judea. 10 years earlier, there had already been an initial exile of Yehoiachin from Israel. The Nebuchadnezzar had sent his troops in and had taken prisoners from Yerushalayim into Babel, including Daniel and other people like that. But now, what's happened is Tzidkiyahu has failed in his job, and Tzidkiyahu has rebelled against the Nebuchadnezzar. And here in the 9th year of Nebuchadnezzar reign, on the 10th day, you can see I've underlined these 4 words here. B'chodesh ha'asiri, ba'osor lachodesh. In the 10th month, the 10th day of the 10th month. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is today. Is Teves, is the 10th month of the Jewish calendar. And Asara b'Teves, on that day, what happened? Nebuchadnezzar came with Kol Chayla, with his whole army. That's an amazing statement, Kol Chayla, because he had a massive army. He built towers, and the siege of Jerusalem began. And the siege was really the crucial moment, the beginning of the end of Yerushalayim. He couldn't just walk into Yerushalayim because it was so heavily defended and heavily fortified. But the way it was done in the ancient world is they brought in their engineers and they built like a wall around it, and they sat and waited to starve the inhabitants out. And if we switch in the Tanakh to the book of Yirmiyah, right, we get in Yirmiyah, the book of Yirmiyah, an account of the terrible suffering of the starvation, right? And even in Eicha, he speaks about the terrible starvation which preceded the Churban, and how people were literally dying in the streets of desperation and starvation. And the whole starvation issue was triggered off on the Asara b'Teves, on the 10th of Teves, by this siege. The pasuk continues, "V'tovoi ha'ir b'matzor." Right, matzor is the siege. There's also a road, isn't there, around the corner in Katabod. There's a road, Rechov HaMatzor. You find lots of roads named after all sorts of different events, which is the Matzor is the siege, right, until the 11th year. In other words, it was a siege from the 9th year to the 11th year, 2 years of siege. And then B'tisha Lachodesh, right? And now we're talking about the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is the Tisha B'Av, right? So this is the beginning of the final moment. The famine became so acute, there was no food left. But Tiboka Ho'ia, the city, the Babylonian soldiers breached the walls, and the soldiers entered, and some people tried to escape, and the troops of Nebuchadnezzar pursued them. If you can read here, they caught the king Tzidkiyahu, and they put him on trial. And you can see here they slaughtered Tzidkiyahu's. You can see here they slaughtered Tzidkiyahu's sons before his eyes, and then they blinded him. It was a terrible time. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av. I'm sorry. So the Av, the Chamishi, the 5th month is Av. On the 7th of Av was the beginning of the actual destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and was completed on the 9th of Av, and hence Tisha B'Av. Right. This is just. I'm sure you've all seen this before, but on Asara b'Teves, it's worth recalling for us this terrible moment of Yisrof as Beis Hashem, as Beis HaMelech, as Kol Bota Yerushalayim, as Kol Beis Gadol Sorach Bo'esh. Everything was burnt to the ground. And this was the end of the glorious period which began with Shlomo HaMelech building the Bayis Rishon. And the Bayis Rishon stood for 410 years, according to Chazal, and is now razed to the ground by the Babylonians. And of course, the actual burning is on Tisha B'Av, but the beginning of the siege is Asara B'Teves, and as a final act of the Nebuchadnezzar, what he did was Chomos. Can you see this? Chomos Yerushalayim Soviv Mitzu Kol Chel Kastim Asher Arab Tabachim. They tore down the walls of Jerusalem, and that was the end. That was the final disaster. And all of the Jews who survived were taken into exile into Bavel, and they remained there really forever. Ad Hayom Hazeh. Golus Bavel was one of the most remarkable exiles in the history of the Jewish people. And in a sense, it wasn't the Jewish people survived in Bavel. The Babylonians themselves, while they were living in Bavel, they prospered. They prospered so much, in fact, that not many of them were willing to come back to Yerushalayim with Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the Bayis Sheni. They were doing quite well in Bavel. But many centuries later, you find that when in Israel, after the destruction of the Second Temple, there was Roman, not Babylonian now, but now Roman persecution in Jerusalem. Really, the Mishnah was written still in Israel. It was the last centuries of Jewish life in Israel at the time. But then the Gemara already is written in Bavel. It's a Talmud Bavli, because Israel became completely decimated by the Romans. Anyhow, what we're commemorating today on Asara B'Teves is the first real moment of it was really the beginning of the end. That's what Asara B'Teves is about. The beginning of the end. Interestingly, Asara B'Teves also was given a new modern significance. Does anybody know what Asara B'Teves meant in Israel in many communities? Anybody know?
The Holocaust.
Yes, the Holocaust. In what sense the Holocaust? What about the Holocaust?
The Yom HaKadosh HaKlali.
That's right. Yom HaKadosh HaKlali. Sadly, there are lots and lots of people who were, of course, perished in the Holocaust, were murdered in the Holocaust, about who didn't leave behind anyone to say Kaddish for them. And we don't even know their yahrzeits, right? And we don't, clearly they weren't buried anywhere. So this was really a terrible disaster. So the Rabbanut Rashit at the beginning of the State of Israel decided Asara B'Teves is Yom HaKadosh HaKlali, is the day where people say Kaddish for those who have perished in the Holocaust. My mother, Zichron Livracha, for example, came from Germany, and she was a sole survivor of quite a big family. She had parents and siblings, and uncles and aunts and cousins, and everybody perished in Germany in the Holocaust. And she managed to get to England as an 18-year-old girl, just by the skin of her teeth, like a few weeks before war broke out. But in fact, I remember that when we sat Shiva for my father, Zichron Livracha, so we were sitting together with my brother and sister and my mother. We were all sitting together. And my mother remarked to me at the time, and for me it was quite a shock. She said to me, "You should know," she said, I'm 90 years old, but this is the first time in my life I'm sitting Shiva. I've never sat Shiva before, because all my relatives died on unknown dates, in unknown places, and really just sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. And this is the first time in my life I'm sitting Shiva. And I just brought it home to me sort of very powerfully, that whole generation of Holocaust survivors, what it was like really to be completely alone after such a massive destruction. And similarly, my mother-in-law, Mrs. Bluma Avers, Zichron Livracha, who had a number on her arm from Auschwitz, also was a sole survivor in Amsterdam of her entire family. So we feel, our family, we feel that we are sort of the Sha'iris HaPleto, that the fact that we exist at all was simply really because, one or two people managed somehow to escape the furnace, which was the Holocaust. And a similar thing happened, Asara B'Teves, the massacre and the destruction was enormous at the Churban Abayis, but those people who escaped, they were taken into exile, into Bavel. They weren't left in the land of Israel. A few were left under the leadership of Gedalia ben Achikam, and then Gedalia was killed. And that's the same Gedalia. That's the next fast of the Churban, because that was really just the Sha'iris HaPleto, the remnants of the exile. So really, Jewish history is not a simple matter, but in a sense, the more we read about it, the more remarkable is the century in which we live. That we are living in a century which somehow has managed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us that special hashgacha to be allowed to begin the process of restoring that which was destroyed. There's still a long way to go, ladies and gentlemen. There's still a long way to go to restore it completely. But for us nowadays, I think Asara B'Teves is also, of course, the sadness, but it also contains within it a little bit of a spark of hope and of future of Klal Yisrael. So I'd like to show you where do we find that in the Tanakh, because as I said to you, the psukim that we've just learned from Malachim Beis, they describe the disaster. But let's have a look at Zechariah for a minute. So Zechariah comes a little bit later in the next generation. Zechariah is accompanying Ezra and Nehemiah back to the land of Israel to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. So let's have a look at this. This is Zechariah chapter 8, right? The prophecy of the rebuilding. So he actually does two things, Zechariah. He actually witnesses the physical rebuilding of Yerushalayim. But it's quite clear from the psukim that everybody who saw the rebuilding of the second temple realized that the second temple was really only a shadow of the Bayis Rishon. In fact, there's a very interesting pasuk in Zechariah where he says that there was ziknei, there were the very old people of the generation who were present at the inauguration of the second temple, who still had known the first temple in their early youth. So where everybody was singing and dancing and celebrating the inauguration of the Bayis Sheni, they were crying. They were crying because they were saying, this is the Beis Hamikdash compared to what we saw earlier, right? And this is a very, I think, a lot of pathos in these psukim, a lot of sadness. So he says here is a prophecy of Zechariah. I hope you can see the text. He gets a prophecy from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you can see here the text, right? Hashem Tzavos, Kinesi L'Tzion Kino Gedola, V'Chemo Gedola Kinesi Lo. I am jealous for Tzion. Jealous here in this sense means I'm not going to stand by idly, Kaviyachal HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, and look at a desolate Tzion and Yerushalayim. Kayoma Hashem. So the pasuk reads here, Kayoma Hashem. Can you see this? Shavti el Tzion v'shalchanti b'soch Yerushalayim. So actually, it's written in the past tense, but the message here is in the future tense. Shavti el Tzion means I will return to Tzion and I will dwell in Yerushalayim. Although in a sense, it could mean I have returned because he is looking at the Bayis Sheni. So in a sense, that's all part of the ambiguity in the whole book of Zechariah. Exactly which parts of it refer to what he's actually seeing with his eyes, and which part refer to what he's seeing with the eye of prophecy in his vision. He's looking at the Bayis Sheni. He knows this is not the Geula Achrona, this is not the ultimate Geula.
Strokes.
So he's saying,
Walk there?
hello? Maybe I should just once again mute people. I'm getting a bit of background noise here just for a minute. You forgive me. I'm just mute again just to clear out the some background noise. Okay, let's get back to the text. Okay, so Zechariah is very beautiful in that sense, that he's also describing the here and now, but he's also describing the future. And this next pasuk is a very beautiful pasuk in modern times, because part of his vision, if I'm not mistaken, this pasuk that we're going to read now is written up on a plaque in the old city of Yerushalayim today, and it's a very beautiful pasuk where Zechariah has a nevuah which says Koyom Hashem Tzavachos Od Yeshvu Zakenim Uzakenos Berachovos Yerushalayim. Old men and women will sit, and the implication is sit peacefully in the Rechovot Yerushalayim, right? In other words, they'll be walking on a stick because they're old and vulnerable, but they'll be feeling safe. Right? In other words, he has a vision of a future time when there'll be nothing to be scared of in Yerushalayim. Sadly, today it's still a little bit scary. Baruch Hashem, we go to the old city of Yerushalayim and to the Kosel and walk in the streets of Yerushalayim regularly. But there is still an element of danger, right? And he says there will come a time when the elderly, and look at this next passage, it's also very beautiful, Rechovos ha'iyah, the streets of the city. Oops. Second. I don't know why my highlighting does this to me sometimes. Second. Rechovos ha'iyah will be filled with little children playing in the street. And I think that is just a very beautiful vision that Zechariah had 2,500 years ago, which we are living through. So if anybody asks you what period are we living in, we're living inside the nevuah of Zechariah Hanav, inside his nevuah. Because he, in his mind's eye, he saw a time when there'll be little children playing in the streets and they won't be afraid. There'll be elderly people sitting in the street chatting with each other and they won't be afraid. And that was a simon of the return to Yerushalayim. So probably in his lifetime, he saw that happen partially, but also he is prophetically looking years ahead to a time, to our generation, where we are once again experiencing that. I find these psukim particularly inspiring. This pasuk is an interesting one as well. It says, Hashem Tzavakos. Can you see this pasuk? It says, right? What I'm prophesying might seem impossible to you, because they were heavily defending Yerushalayim against all sorts of enemies. It might seem impossible to you that little children and elderly people will feel completely safe, even though they're vulnerable. But he says it might sound impossible, but it will happen. And then he goes on to speak about kibbutz golios, right? And I will, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will rescue my people from all over the world, from the lands of the east and the north and the south. Can you see this? I will rescue my people from the lands of the east and lands of the west. They will all come back to Yerushalayim, right? And then he says, but Zechariah himself is somebody who always uses every opportunity to emphasize the, if you like, the moral dimension of Klal Yisrael. In other words, everything, all the good prophecies of Klal Yisrael are dependent on the can you see this? V'hevesi osam v'shachnu b'soch Yerushalayim, and I'll bring them all back to live in Yerushalayim. V'ani elehim be'emes u'v'tzedakah. What he's saying here is, so to speak, on condition that they live with both emes and tzedakah. The emes and the tzedakah is what Zechariah is really emphasizing and as the key. And then he goes on to say, this is what is required of you. Look at these words from the Navi, very beautiful. This is what you need to do. Dabru emes ish esrei ehu. Emes umishpat shalom shiftu b'sharei. True and perfect justice in your gates. It's interesting that Zechariah, like a few other Nevi'im, doesn't rebuke them about, I don't know, about violating the Shabbos or violating kashrus or any of the mitzvahs bein Adam l'makah. But his emphasis very much is on bein Adam l'chaveira, to live with each other with emes and shalom between each other. And that is really, I think, the message of every tainus. Every tainus should be a pause for thought to in some way restore the emes and the shalom. Shiftu b'sha'areichem. Can you see this? These are the things they are to do. Speak the truth to one another. Render true and perfect justice in your gates. In other words, that is really the key to the return of Yerushalayim. And quite a right. Emes umishpat v'shalom. And now comes in and the final interesting bit why I chose this chapter from Zechariah, because look what he says here in this pasuk. Kayom Hashem tzavakas. This is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, and he speaks about the ta'anesim, and this is the only source that we have in the Tanakh for the ta'anesim that we have for the Churban Habayis. But it's clear that already at the time of Zechariah, which is less than a century after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, right? The ta'anesim, the fast days, had already been instituted. Look what he says here. Kayom Hashem tzavakas. Tzom haravi'i, the fast of the fourth month. What is the fourth month? Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz. The fast of the fourth month is what we call Shiva Asa B'Tammuz. But Tzom HaChamishi is Av, is the fast of Tisha B'Av. The Tzom HaShavi'i, what is the seventh month, is Tishri, what we call Tzom Gedalia. The Tzom HaAsiri, and the fast of the 10th month, I can see here it says Asiri, the 10th month, that's today. The fast of the Asiri is Asara B'Teves. These four ta'anesim were known to Zechariah, and he calls them a tzom. Right? So it's actually quite unusual in the sense when one thinks about these ta'anesim, all these four ta'anesim, in general, are halachically categorized as mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. They are of rabbinic origin, right? There is nothing in the Chumash. They're not mitzvahs min HaTorah, they're mitzvahs midrabanan. Now that's true, but we have a pasuk here in Zechariah, which tells us that at the time of the Tanakh already, at the time of the Tanakh, there was already well known. Zechariah is already referring to these Tanesim. He's referring to these Tanesim, and he's speaking about the fact that we are fasting to commemorate the Churban Habayis. But look what he says. It's something very interesting. What does he say about these Tanesim? So he says these four Tanesim. You see this? The Tanesim of Shivasa B'Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, Tzod Gedalia, and Asara B'Teves. These are the four Tanesim, the four fast days in the calendar of the Churban. So he says, I can see in my Nevuah, I can see, look what he can see. I can see Yiyeh lebeis Yehuda lesosoin ulesimcha ulemoyadim teveh. They will one day become yontifs. They'll become days of sosoin and simcha and of moyed. Under what condition? For ha'emes v'hashalom ehovu. Once Klal Yisrael learn properly how to love, interesting, he uses the word love. He doesn't just say obey or follow the principles of truth and peace, but he says once you come to love honesty and integrity, this is a very, very beautiful and powerful pasuk in Zechariah. So he's promising us that one day the day will come. In other words, part of his nevuah is already slightly becoming true, both the ingathering of Klal Yisrael from all the countries and the ability to sit in the streets of Yerushalayim relatively safe, not completely safe. There are all sorts of incidents still happening, sadly, all the time. And the threat of future incidents is there all the time. And it's really HaKadosh Baruch Hu's protection, giving the power and the strength to the Kochot HaBitachon, to the army and the security forces, which enables us to sit relatively. I'm sitting in Efrat, you know that, don't you? I'm sitting in Efrat in the middle of Gush Etzion, right between Beit Lechem and Hebron. Now, if you tell somebody who doesn't live in Israel, where are you living? I'm living between Beit Lechem and Hebron. They think you're living in a war zone. They think you're living, in the middle of a place which is unbelievably dangerous. But if I look out of the window, I can see little kids playing in the streets, right? And the shops and the supermarkets and the pizza shops are full. And people are living here in a very relaxed and happy way. And all of these, all the Yishuvim here, whether it's Neve Daniel or Elazar or Efrat or Alon Shvut, all these surrounding Yishuvim of Gush Etzion are prospering and booming, and they all feel safe and they feel happy. And of course they need to have protection. That's absolutely true. But certainly part of Zechariah's nevuah, we can certainly, if we have the eyes to see it, we should be able to see it very clearly in front of our eyes. And then he goes on to say something also equally interesting, which we haven't really seen yet. Gosh. And that is that the other nations of the world will realize that there's something remarkable happening in Israel and will want to join in. We're going to come to see the house of Hashem. In other words, they will realize that the people of many cities will come to Yerushalayim because they will feel the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, in Yerushalayim. That is a reference, if you like, to the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, the restoration of the Shechina. That sadly has not taken place yet, but right? Uvo amim rabim v'goyim atzumim. Look at this pasuk here, amazing pasuk. Uvo amim rabim v'goyim atzumim levakesh es Hashem tzavos b'Yerushalayim v'lachalos es pnei Hashem. They'll all come to daven in Yerushalayim. So this is a nevuah which already Yeshaya had a couple of 100 years earlier. But Zechariah, who is looking at the Bayis Sheni, he is saying this is not happening yet. It hasn't happened yet that the nations of the world realize what a wonderful spiritual center Yerushalayim is. And he's saying that what is required is for emes v'ashalom ehavu. So these are just when I was thinking about which psukim really carry with them the meaning and the purpose of Asara B'Teves, I think one has to learn together the psukim of Melachim Beis, which is the account of the massacre, the tragedy, and the starvation on the one hand, and then you have to read the pasuk of Zechariah, which is the nevuah of optimism and future, and realize, first of all, the moral message of emes v'shalom ehavu, but realize that we are actually in a very privileged century, that we are seeing the unfolding of that nevuah, which is Zechariah has given us to show us the way forward. Od yeshvu zakenim uzakenos. I'm not sure where it's written. Does anybody know where it's written? I think it's written up on a plaque somewhere in the Ir Atikah, in the old city, on one of the streets or one of the squares. Yes, Tina.
It's written where actually that people died during Melchemet. I don't remember if it was the Melchemet HaShichur or the 6 day war, but I think it's Melchemet HaShichur. There's like a mass grave kind of where I think 28 people died, fighters, and there they have a plaque that says it, I believe.
In the old city?
In the old city, yes.
Okay. Is it on one of the streets or one of the squares or something?
It's on the way to Har Zion, I think.
On the way to Har Zion. Yes,
Yeah.
Hadassah?
Yeah, I think so.
On the way to Har Zion.
Ken, what I wanted to show you, there's Neve Daniel and Derech Avot.
Beautiful.
What, from your window?
Yeah, my sukkah.
So we're not far away from each other.
No, just across the road.
Very, very nice. The Neve Daniel is a beautiful place, and all the Yishuvim around here are really prospering. And to look out of your window and see the Harei Yehuda and see the vineyards and the orchards and the fields, and to feel safe, that's the most extraordinary thing, right?
Baruch Hashem.
The Baruch Hashem, the Chazdei Hashem, when you say Hallel, you say Kol Goyim Sabavuni, Hashem Hashem Ki Amilam Sabuni Gam Sabavuni, right? They surround me, Sabuni Kidvorim, they surround me like wasps, like bees, surrounding us, threatening us. But actually, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'Shem Hashem Ki Amilam, the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects us and gives strength and insight and courage to the Chayalim and Chayalot to do their duty. And this is the amazing century in which we live. And certainly whenever I read about, for example, Asara B'Teves and the background to it, it only makes me feel more gratitude and appreciation for the era through which we are living, and not to take it for granted. So if there's any purpose to Asara B'Teves, it's not to take it for granted that we're living in Eretz Yisrael, we're living in safety. Not that it's completely safe. Everyone has to still be cautious and be aware. And a few people have told me already, since I moved into Efrat, I have to buy a gun. Not quite sure exactly whether that's such a fantastic idea for me. I would certainly have to first of all learn which way up to hold it, and how to use it, and when to use it, and if to use it. But certainly lots of people here walk around with guns in their belts, but I've rarely heard of anybody having to use it. But nevertheless, one has to be cautious. Definitely one has to be cautious everywhere in Israel. There's no question everywhere. You have to take precautions. But thank you, Hadassah, for that wonderful view outside of. You're in Neve Daniel?
We just moved here. From Yerushalayim,
We moved from Yerushalayim to Neve Daniel.
two kids,
Beautiful.
two of our kids.
How wonderful. Just like we moved from Yerushalayim to
Yeah.
Efrat. Yes,
Nachon.
quite a few people are moving out of the city into the surrounding areas. And and Gush Etzion is definitely one of the areas. The other big area, of course, is Ramat Beit Shemesh, where also is a place just outside Yerushalayim, which is growing phenomenally. And so is Ramot. Ramot is also one of the suburbs. Yerushalayim is mushrooming. So Baruch Hashem, this is the bracha of our generation to see the amount of amount that's going on here. Of course, what also happens is the prices of property are skyrocketing everywhere. I'm not quite sure what to do about that, but to the best of my knowledge, Zachariah did not speak about that particular problem. So, although maybe there's a gematria somewhere in Zachariah. What do you think, Phil? Nice to see you, Phil, on the screen. There's probably a gematria somewhere about property prices. What do you think? Probably, yes. Probably the case. Anyhow, that is the story. So we are learning Bereshis. And in Bereshis, as I mentioned to you before, there are really the original, if you like, the seeds of future events. And one of the sad aspects of the destruction of Yerushalayim, sadly, was internal machlokas. Internal machlokas, Chazal referred to it later on as sinas chinam, but it's the fighting that goes on within Klal Yisrael. And that's why Zechariah mentions repeatedly, he's talking about internal shalom. He's talking about living peacefully with each other and living truthfully and honestly with each other, right? The message of Zechariah 2,500 years ago is still very relevant for today. I wanted to show you a little bit in Bereshis. We've still got about 10 minutes of the Shia. Let's go back to Avraham Avinu and let's have a look at another text for 1 minute. See if I can get that up on the screen relatively quickly. Okay, right. This particular piece of text I have called, so look at it. This particular text I've called Lot the Problematic Nephew, right? Every family's got a problematic nephew somewhere, right? So the problematic nephew in the story of Avraham Avinu is Lot. Interestingly, so long as Avram was a relatively poor man and an immigrant, they managed to live together well. But when they come back from Egypt, they come back wealthy. And it's the wealth which creates machlokas. And this is a paradox, really, in a sense, because you would have thought if they could live together in poverty, why can't they live together in affluence? But there's something about affluence which makes people more selfish and more egoistic and less willing to share. It's a paradox of human nature that people in poverty are more willing to share, and people in affluence are often less willing to share. And that's part of the story of Lot. Let's have a look at the story briefly, even though you know the story. Lot also returns from Egypt, a wealthy man, but look at this pasuk. The land wasn't able to support them staying together. They had wealth, they had a lot of possessions. This is a very sad statement, but sadly in history, it's something which has repeated itself often, that because of their wealth, they couldn't anymore live together. And as a result of which, says the pasuk, Vayehi Riv, there was a riv, a machlokas emerged. Bein roye mikne Avraham, ubein roye mikne Lot. they started fighting. The shepherds of Avram, the shepherds of Lot, were fighting with each other, even though they were both wealthy and they had more than enough, but they started fighting with each other. And the pasuk ends up, it's a very interesting pasuk, this. I want you to have a look at this pasuk on the screen, because the pasuk has got two halves to it, but the second half seems to be a non sequitur. The second part of the pasuk seems to be disconnected to the first. Do you understand what I mean? The first part reads, "Vahi riv bein roya mikna Avram bein Rivka." They were fighting with each other. Okay, that's the first part. And then it says, "Va'knani va'prizi oz yoshev haaretz." The Canaanites and Prizes were dwelling in the land. Now we knew that already. We know that Avram has come to the Eretz HaKnani, Va'prizi, Va'chiti. We know that. So why is the pasuk here saying they were fighting with each other and the Canaani and Prizi were in the land? So let's have a quick look at this. Vahi riv, so the Ramban quotes Rashi, says, what happened was the shepherds of Lot, says Rashi, would take their flock to graze in anybody's field. They were simply they would steal the fields of the local people. And what was their defense? And they would say, "V'heim omrim nitna haaretz la'Avram." And so look what's happening here. This is Rashi according to the Medrash, which the Ramban is not so happy with, incidentally. Rashi says that the shepherds of Avram, shepherds of Lot, were saying, "Look, God has promised this land to Avram. Avram has no children, ein yoresh, and therefore his nephew will inherit it. So we can already now take this land because we are the heirs of this land for sure." Right? Va'ani tameya, says the Ramban. I don't quite get this, Rashi. Ki hamatana shene'emer la'Avram lezara hoisa. Avram wasn't promised the land for himself; he was promised for his descendants. Lazarach etem. So he says, "Va'api apshat." The Ramban tells us, "Api apshat hoisa marivo al hamare kila nosa osama oretz. The kasha hoya mikne Avram roeba ba'achu hoyoroy load boy bigvulam." As what happened was there were so many sheep and cattle of Avram and Lot that they were sort of competing for land which would to enable them to be shepherds together. But have a look at this. The Sforno I thought was interesting. Va'knani va'prizi oz yoshvei haaretz. Remember that what all the Meforshim are trying to do is to explain what is the connection between the first part and the second part of the pasuk. So the Sforno says the first part is they had a riv, a machlokas, and the second part is the Canaani and Prizi. So he says here, L'chein hoya hariv bein shnei achim. This machlokas between Avram and Lot, mavish es reichom. Mavish es reichom means, anyone know mavish es reichom be'enei atoshavim, actually gave them a bad reputation. It embarrassed them in the eyes of the local residents. Right? Ki bihayos marivo beino achim. If there is a machlokes between the brothers who are living together, he gave them a bad reputation. In other words, it was the fight between the brothers, right, which brings in intervention from the Canaanim and the Prizi. The Canaanim and the Prizi were leaving them alone. But when they saw them fighting with each other, they realized this is an opportunity. Or let's put it this way, they might have come to realize this would be an opportunity for them to attack them. So long as Avram and Lot were united, then the Canaani and Prizi left them alone. But as soon as they saw them fighting with each other, says the Sforno, this was an opportunity for them to take over. A similar story we found, found a similar story right at the end of Bais Sheni period, where two Hasmonean kings were fighting with each other, and that's why the Romans came in the first place, because they saw the machlokas. I just want to end up the last few minutes with the Kli Yakar. So the Kli Yakar says here, see this Kli Yakar? So he says, Rashi Pirish Smichas Vaknani Vaprizi Oz Yoshev Oretz Loma. Rashi says that why does it say Kanani and Prizi to teach us that the land still belongs to the Kanani and Prizi, and therefore the Roel Lot were wrong. Nobody had inherited the land yet. Bakosha Lama Hiske Kana Prizi. Why does it mention the Prizi at all before it speaks only about the Kanani? Bakan Hiske Yoshev and Hiske Zelamala. Yesh Omrim. So have a look at the Kli Yakar here, the last two lines of the Kli Yakar, where this will finish. He says, V'yesh Omrim Shabbat Saloma, that the Pasuk wants to tell us, Elu Shnei Umos Gedolos, these two big nations, Aknani v'Aprizi, Nisyashu ba'aretz, they were inhabitants of the land, below Mariva, and they weren't fighting with each other. Ushnei Roim Elu, but these two groups of shepherds, they couldn't live peacefully together. So the inability, right? And I think this really brings us back to what Zachariah was saying about Asara B'Teves, the inability of different sections of Klal Yisrael to live peacefully with each other is really, sadly, very, very sadly, one of the crucial issues which has plagued the Jewish people forever. Right, starting with the brothers of Yosef, going all the way through the time of the Beis HaMikdash and the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and Zachariah is telling us, look, there is an opportunity. There's a possibility, says the Pasuk, to transform the Ta'anesim of Tisha B'Av and Asara B'Teves. All the Ta'anesim can be transformed into days of Sosa V'Simcha. What's the condition? For Emes V'Ashalom Ehovu. If the society will learn to love peace among themselves and the pursuit of MS, then that is the key. And we see already in Avraham Avinu says to Lot, look, we can't live together. You go one way, I'll go the other way, because we're living together is causing only machlokas. So this concept of internal machlokas is already built in, sadly, into the Jewish people, and it's probably the single greatest moral and national challenge for Klal Yisrael. But just to come back to Zachariah Novi, even though the narrative of the Tanakh ends in Melachim Beis chapter 25 with the Churban, the prophecies of the Tanakh don't end with the Churban. The prophecies of the Tanakh end with a vision of everybody sitting in the streets of Yerushalayim, feeling that they are not, that they are safe, and that they're not vulnerable, and that we'll be able to rebuild Yerushalayim to its fullest. And that's our hope on Asara B'Teves. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. Eli Friedwald wasn't able to join us today, but